Now we come to the great turning point. There was a very long period where Americans viewed themselves as the English abroad. They were settlers in this foreign land, but they're still the English. So they mastered the language. They read the great books. They the ones who read, and they basically labored under the idea that one day, if they wanted to, they could get up and go to London and become a Londoner if they so wished. The English had a different perspective on that than the colonists, but it took a while for the colonists to get that understanding. So the turning point for all that, in my mind, was about 1750 with the development of the French and Indian War. And the French and Indian War is the perspective of the colonists and the British. This is who we're fighting. But from the point of view of the French and the Indians and their colonists, it was probably the British and the Indians, because the Indians didn't fall on one side or the other. They made alliances just like any other nations or countries would. When we talk about the American Indians, we're talking about something more like Europe. We're talking about something more like, most of the places in the world where there are different groups, and those groups didn't necessarily like one another. And they almost certainly didn't like the new people on the block, but sometimes they could make alliances with them against their fellow indigenous tribes, because they have their own motives, they had their own reasons for acting. So that's part of what complicated this war. Again, very, very few things, if you try to understand them as simple, you're probably not going to understand. So this raises some questions. They are questions that we had, the Americans had, after the war, and they were basically, were the English too greedy? They won the war. They won they doubled, tripled, quadrupled the size of their empire in North America. Good for them. But they didn't much want to share. They didn't much want the colonists on the eastern shores of the U.S., or what became the U.S., to go inland and settle in those areas. They had other plans for those newfound wealth that they had come upon as a result of the war. On the other hand, they looked at it as, okay, well, this is all ours. We won the war. Yeah, you did a lot of the fighting, but we won the war, and so it's all ours, the British. And the Americans went, but shouldn't we get a piece of that? Aren't we British too? And the British said, well, no, not so much, but we will charge you for your efforts. So there was an extensive effort to tax the American goods coming into their ports, teas and so on, and to basically try to extract the cost of the war. Because while the British had won, and they had won big, it had been a very expensive venture. So they wanted their money back. And therein, that money is always a source of difficulty between peoples. And so we'll see that led to some reaction. The colonists. if you read, stories of the contemporary relationships between the British and the Americans, at least in the spy trade, at least in the spy novels, they often refer to the Americans as the cousins. That, we're related. We're maybe not absolutely directly related, but we're closely related, and we're on a par with one another. The attitude of the colonizers, of the rulers of the British Empire, was more along the line of your children. And these are the children on a foreign shore, and we are here to guide them and develop them. These attitudes come up a lot in the world. That didn't really, in the long run, it took us, the Americans, a while to realize, okay, we're never going to be part of the club. We are always going to be these relatives who are kind of on the side. But we eventually figured that out. Complex alliances and goals on the part of all the different peoples that were walking, and we'll be focusing on North America this time around, but all the peoples of all the different backgrounds all had their own motives, all had their own goals, and that makes all this, again, complicated. But what did the Americans learn from that experience? I think what they learned was it's time to run our own show. Let's take a look.
This is a really rugged area that we're looking at. This whole northeastern part of what was to become the United States, a lot of mountains, a lot of major lakes, a lot of major rivers. So it's not an easy area to wander around, and it is not a good area in which to try to conduct warfare in the manner that either the French or the English had originally done in Europe. Prior to the war, the French were the main landholders in North America, holding a swathe of land all the way from Canada down to the Gulf of Mexico and well out into what was to become the western part of the United States. The English were restricted pretty much to colonies on the coast and a few um, establishments in Canada and on the coast of Canada. Now, several very important players in the American Revolution, people that we refer to as founding fathers, became involved in the French and Indian War. And one of those key players, because he was involved in the Albany Plan, is Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin was one of the most brilliant people ever born in North America. He could do just about everything. And he started out very much as an apprentice, as working his way up. He's not a guy that went to college. He's a guy that educated himself, and he became one of the leading minds of his time. In 1754, after the war had broken out, and I'll tell you a little bit about that war in a moment, but after the war had broken out, it involved all the colonies and in conflict with French and Indian tribes in the interior of the just beyond the colonies. At that point, the colonies were trying to spread west, and they were running into conflict. They were causing conflict. Um, Franklin's proposition at the Albany Conference, a meeting, a congress of colonies that met in 1754, was that we form one country. that we bring it together under one president and that we coordinate our taxation and we coordinate our war efforts. And this, to the people at the Albany Congress, seemed like a really good idea because they were beset by the French and Indians in all directions, and there was concern about whether the French might come to the coast and sweep them away. So he, among other things, was a publisher, and he created one of the first cartoons, political cartoons in America, and that was the Join or Die cartoon that you see in the slide. And the snake is divided into parts, and clearly the snake is going to do better if it pulls itself together into one creature in terms of spreading, defending itself. Interestingly enough, to me, this symbolism was brought forward into the American Revolution, and in the American Revolution, many people carried a flag that said, "Don't tread on me," and it showed an intact snake defending itself against all comers. So it was Ben Franklin had some real insight into how Americans would see themselves and see the prospect for unification. So, brilliant idea, the Albany Plan. Was absolutely rejected by all the colony governments. Each colony had its own separate American government under an English governor, and they just didn't want to do this. They valued their separation, and they valued their differences on religious lines, on education lines, on their relationships to the parliament versus the king, on a variety of different scales. Each of these colonies was different, and the idea of getting together just did not appeal to them. So Ben Franklin, remember that guy. He's an important name in American history. George Washington. This is the debut of America's probably greatest founding father, probably most respected president, because he created the office of president later on after the Revolutionary War. But in 1850, he was a young guy, and he was a lieutenant. He was sent out to negotiate with the French, who were on the frontier. The English wanted to expand. The French didn't want them to. The governor of Virginia said, "Look, George, I want you to take this letter to the French and tell them to get out, go away." And he did that. And unfortunately, that wasn't very successful. But he returned, gave his information, and was put in charge of an expedition to go out and, instead of asking the French to leave, encourage them with gunpowder to leave. And he did this. The fort that he was tasked with getting rid of, however, had been reinforced, and there was no possibility of him having success there. So he attacked a smaller group of French, had some success with that, but then got counterattacked and ended up creating something called Fort Necessity. And Fort Necessity was just that. It was a small log fort, like you see in the bottom of the picture, and it was thrown together in a few days in order to defend against the French. And the French attacked. They overran the fort. Fortunately for George, he was able to escape with most of his troops and return. But George Washington, who later on became General George Washington, the prime leader of our troops, the first president of our country, did not have a lot of luck in the early days of the French and Indian War. He was later on assigned to be an aide to General Braddock. General Braddock was a British general who had come and he was going to clean things up. And he had a large number, several Irish regiments that had been brought from England, and they were going to go out into the frontier and they were going to deal with the French. Didn't work out well. Basically, the British were very brave, the Irish troops were very brave, but they were fighting the wrong war. They were walking into the woods, the forests, the mountains of America and thinking that it was Europe. And in Europe, you know, you could have open fields and you could allocate armies and you could put one army against another and everybody knew what they were supposed to do. It was almost like a game is always a hard time way of thinking about war, but in fact, it was something, there were some rules of war. Um, when the British decided that they were going to exercise their muscle in America, they found out that there were a whole different set of rules. And the French were much more adept at using those rules. The French had formed close alliances with certain Indian tribes in Canada and in the western United States to the west of the colonies. And they basically were fighting them, using them as proxies to fight the war. There were very few, yeah, there were some, there were plenty, I guess, but there were a relatively small number of French troops in North America, but they were using the Indians to drive the settlers out and to implement the French policies. Um, they adapted the type of warfare techniques that the Indians had learned to use, which is, you know, you don't stand out in front of someone and let them shoot you. You hide behind a tree and you shoot them, or you shoot your arrow at them, or you go and use your tomahawk to knock them in the back of the head when they're not looking. This, by Indian warfare, and by probably modern warfare as far as that goes, is concerned, is okay. This is how you do it because the other guy's dead and you're still alive. But the British did not understand this, and they got wiped out. 2 regiments, thousands of men killed in the woods because they're standing there in their bright red coats being shot from all sides out of the woods by people that they cannot see. And George performed very bravely as an aide to General Braddock. Was in fact awarded a sash, as you see by the picture on the left. But bravery sometimes is not enough. And General Braddock was killed, wounded, and died as a result of this. And George Washington basically, again, was responsible for leading the retreat, getting what troops remained out of the area and back into English territory. So the war went on for years and years, and it was a great consumer of money for the British. And this in itself created some of the reasons for the American Revolution, because the British went in and spent a tremendous amount of their treasury in order to preserve the colonies, and they wanted to get paid back. And this later on became a source of conflict between the British and the American. We'll talk about that next week. But for right now, just remember that the French and Indian War was an extremely important turning point. And it went on for about 7 years. It was part of a larger conflict in Europe between England and France. This might come up in a question sometime. And 2 key people in the French and Indian War were Benjamin Franklin and George Washington from the point of view of American history. And this is the east coast of North America at the end of the French and Indian War in 1763. Great consequences for the French as a result of this war. Basically, to this day, there is a large portion of the Canadian population that are French descent, and the province of Quebec is a major French center. But as far as France is concerned, they were out of the game. They had been tossed out, and this was entirely a British-controlled affair as far as North America and the 13 colonies, and much of the frontier over to the Mississippi were completely in British hands.